So we just learned that there is no simultaneous interpretation available in the room, only via Zoom. So if you need translation from German into English, you could dial in at Zoom. You could zoom in and follow the translation via phone, as I got it, right? Otherwise, of course, I can try to improvise and do my introduction in English, what I will probably do. So, little surprise, but we can manage it. Aishel, would you like to make an announcement about the questionnaire?
Yeah, does it work? Great. I just wanted to make sure everybody understands we have a QR code that's going to appear also on the screen, and also here around the places you can find a QR code where if you have a question you can write down there, and we're going to receive this and gonna send to Ralf Fuchs for to bring it on the panel and to ask the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Aishel Alieva, together with Lukas Daubner, the heart of our project team. So, okay, let's start, and I will leave away my German manuscript and try to do a short introduction into a long project done in English. Warm welcome to everybody at a cold winter day in Berlin. This is the final event, the closing event of our project Sustainable Russia, Pathways Towards a Climate Neutral Economy. And I'm glad that some friends, partners and colleagues are with us today on spot as well as online. I would like to talk at the beginning a little bit about the starting point and the original intentions of this project, which meanwhile has been passed, or let's say has been rolled over by the dramatic events in the last 2.5 years. When we started the project, the idea was to explore the potential and the possible pathways for ecological modernization of the Russian economy, and maybe a little bit more than just the economy, also Russian policies. And at that time, we had very intense conversations with our long-term friends and partners in Russia. And there was, I would say, a glimmer of hope that climate change and the conversation on ecological modernization could become kind of trigger to start a process of modernization of the Russian economy and also trigger political reforms in the country. Maybe this was an illusion from the beginning, but there not only a few liberal minds in Russia put some hope in this topic, that it could work as an engine of change, or an agency of change in Russia. And if you're looking back, there were some signals at that time, around about 2020. The Russian government signed the Paris Protocol. There had been several international conferences in Russia on climate change, and greening the economy. The discourse was quite open. So there had been some reason that this project could have some impact on the domestic developments in Russia. So there was a small window of opportunity. Let's frame it that way. But foreign organization by the Russian authorities. And of course, this was a first blow to the project, because from then we could not continue the official cooperation with our Russian partners without putting them into risk. Yeah. So we had to find some new pathways to continue the project, and with the support of the Foreign Office here in Berlin, and especially the German Society for Eastern European Research, the DGO, we could continue the project. And I would like to use the opportunity to convey our gratitude to the DGO, especially Gabriele Freitag and her team, for their support. Until February this year, we could finish several scenarios for ecological modernization in Russia, written either by Russian experts or by a team of Russian and German European experts. And then, as everybody of you are aware, February 24th, the renewed Russian attack on Ukraine. And of course, from that day, all the aspirations and all the scenarios for ecological change in Russia had been annulled. There is no base for that and anymore. Literally, the project, the ground under the feet of the project collapsed. But yet, I would say, or I would hope, all the work invested and all the brain invested in the project was not in vain. Maybe the results and these scenarios at the core of the project will become part of a reservoir of change in the future. And of course, we cannot foresee when and how it will happen, but maybe the results are not lost, but only postponed. In Russia, interestingly, the scenario papers had been published in a book by a small publishing house under the title, "Is There a Future After Oil for Russia?" In Germany, 14 articles of Russian environmental journalists were published at the platform Klimareporter.de and found a surprisingly big resonance. Some of the articles had been read by more than 10,000 readers. In addition to that, we have been publishing a series of articles on the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy and the current state of affairs for Russian environmental initiatives and other civil society organizations. Now, with the Russian war of destruction against Ukraine, of course, the framework for the project has been fundamentally changed. And Russia, since the February 24th, is not only waging war against Ukraine, but against its own future. And so we want to use this event, this closing event of the project, to reflect together with German and Russian experts which economic and ecological future Russia is facing under the current situation, and also which impact this war has ecologically, both in Russia and then Ukraine. And in the second part of the conference, we would like to ask which consequences this disastrous war in every aspect will have on the climate cooperation with Russia. In our view, of course, you cannot separate climate policy from the war. Yeah, there will be no separate pathway for climate cooperation as long as this war then continues and until Russian troops have not been withdrawn behind the Russian-Ukrainian border. And even more, I would say, as long as Russia is not departing from this neo-imperial policy, there is no return to any kind of constructive cooperation in sight. So also from a climate policy angle, a defeat of a military and political failure of Russia in Ukraine is a kind of precondition for a return to the better. So far, a preliminary account of these 2.5 years, which have been a kind of roller coaster, politically, economically. And finally, I would like to thank our team, especially Lukas and Aishel, I introduced already at the beginning, for their engagement and their creativity to bring this project to, I would say, kind of reasonable end. So briefly to our today's program, we will start with the first input by Olivia Lassard and Angelina Davidova, war and climate. What are the economic, ecological, and climate policy impacts of the war? How has the Russian energy and climate policy changed since the beginning of the attack on Ukraine, and which impacts do Western sanctions have on especially the Russian energy sector and the Russian climate policy? So I would like to invite our speakers of the first panel. Also the commentators, please, Nora, join us. And in the second part of the conference, we will ask, war and sanctions, is this the end of climate cooperation with Russia? So, Olivia Lassard is a fellow at Carnegie Europe. Her research is focusing on geopolitics of climate, the risk of climate-related conflicts and the fragility of the international system related to climate change and potential environmental collapse. Welcome, Olivia. Angelina Davidova, who has been one of the pillars of the project, intellectual pillars of the project, one of the most well-known climate and environmental journalists from Russia. She's a co-moderator of the podcast, The Eurasian Climate Brief, and now is also frequently publishing on these topics in Germany, because she left St. Petersburg in March this year and is living now in Berlin. Welcome, Angelina. And then we will have two brief comments. Originally, Christina Wegelein, the head of the unit on climate and security in the Foreign Office, wanted to join us now. She's ill, and I'm very happy that Nora Lülle is with us. She's a senior expert in that unit on climate and security, and we know each other from very long-term cooperation in the Bell Foundation, where Nora joined our Washington team. Welcome, Nora. And last but not least, we will have a comment from Jana Sabanova. She's a researcher at the Institute for Transformative Sustainable Research here in Berlin, in the project Geopolitics of the Energy Transition. And she's a specialist in hydrogen economy. So, welcome. Okay, let's start perhaps with Olivia, please.
Thank you so much. Ralph, you said something in your intervention, which was that you can't differentiate the future climate cooperation from the war, or climate from the war. I'm of the same view, for different reasons, having to do both with the impact of the war, but also partly some of the motives maybe that drove Russia into this war with Ukraine. We have a situation where Russia attacked Ukraine, which is one of the biggest breadbaskets in the world, that we know. It's also a country that has been long instrumental for energy provision and energy passages between Russia and Europe to a certain extent. And what struck me when I started researching in the days following the start of the war about the motives behind the war, it struck me that going through a number of Russian national documents, I read a number of different things which were really striking to me, which was that Russia considers that we're entering the most unstable period of human history, and that in order to defend itself in the future, Russia needs to diversify, and it needs to diversify on different grounds. Partly diversifying in terms of investing a lot more into its agricultural base, and this is something that has been going on for a number of years now. Partly also diversifying its energy strategy by pivoting partly away from Europe in terms of its fossil clientelism, because Russia understood that Europe was indeed serious about decarbonization. And the pivot was supposed to happen with Asian partners and Asian clients in terms of gas delivery and in terms of oil delivery. And then Russia needed to invest a lot more in terms of its nuclear partnerships with a number of countries around the world. Now, we know, obviously, that a number of nuclear facilities around the world are made with over 50% of Russian technologies. And then, to my surprise as well, as a researcher focusing also on critical raw materials, I did find a Russian strategy on critical raw materials, which was published in 2020. And which essentially said, well, Russia needs to recover what the Soviet Union was really good at, which was being a superpower in terms of industrial extraction and processing for critical raw materials, even before China was. And this with the view and with the understanding essentially that a part of the world is moving its energy base towards renewables. And so it means that in order for Russia to remain relevant in terms of various types of dependencies, it needs to move into strengthening its own base at home for industrial processing and extraction of certain key materials. And Russia is already very, very good in terms of extracting first grade nickel, palladium, vanadium, and other types of, materials needed for the energy transition, but it needs to go further and it needs to create essentially the type of partnerships that are needed in order to complement its own base. That's why it also has a very strong partnership with Brazil or with other countries in the BRICS area. It's also how we should understand how Russia has been approaching a number of African contexts with the deployment of Wagner troops in contexts such as the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and where it's been also striking a number of military partnerships with countries such as Cameroon or Madagascar that include hydrological research and mineral research. That's also how we need to understand how Russia is reactivating a number of different networks that were the legacy of the Soviet Union in terms of geological research and how to use geological mapping as a way to gain access to a number of different elites within African countries and Central Asian countries as well. And on the basis of all of that, I think that we need to sort of understand the consequences of the war in many different perspectives. The first one being that we need to understand the 24th of February as a fracture in how to understand the future of climate cooperation, the future of geostrategy in the world, and how to sort of really understand the future of our relationships in Russia, understanding that we did not understand them in the right way before, and that we need to engage with Russia in a very, very different light, knowing that we're dealing with a country that has been able to weaponize food, that has not hesitated to lead to a number of different consequences, which we're going to face in 2023, potentially edging on famine and very severe food insecurity in a number of countries in European neighborhoods, including in Tunisia and in Lebanon, leading on to political instability. And then having to do with a Russian actor, which has essentially created misinformation and disinformation bubbles in a number of different regional contexts that it's now able to weaponize against the European Union, against the transatlantic partnership. We also need to understand Russia as an actor that has been a lot more strategic than we thought it was before, on various aspects of energy markets and energy dependencies, and therefore an actor that's going to try to strengthen those relationships. And parts of the effects, ironically, of the sanctions that Europe is aiming to apply at the moment are strengthening essentially the dependencies that Russia wants to create in terms of fossil distribution with Asian partners. And this is what the European Union will need to be very careful about in terms of how to approach Asian partners in the future, or how to deal with the reception of fossil fuels in Asia and the locking in of different dependencies. So to finish off, sort of painting this geostrategic, sort of landscape in a few words. I think that the European Union needs to sort of reposition itself in the future in its relationship with Russia, starting with understanding it as a key actor within this notion of systems rivalry. And systems rivalry plays in direct, indirect, and diffuse threats. We can't really approach Russia going forward in a very direct way as long as we don't understand essentially what its final intentions are with Ukraine and how this war and the end of this war is going to play out. What we can do, however, is understand essentially how Russia wants to shape the outcomes of a systems rivalry into its favor, and therefore counter the effects of the system's outcome shaping by working on better partnerships with countries in Africa, in Central Asia, in the Balkans, in Latin America, and to a certain extent in the Indo-Pacific, by really trying to sort of look at how to strengthen the value proposition that Europe has in terms of food security. And that requires a bit of a different approach than the one that we've had towards conventional agriculture and investment into food security systems as we know them today. It also requires having a very, very strong proposition in terms of the industrial partnerships that we'll have with a number of countries in the Balkans, in Africa, in Latin America, having to do with the Critical Raw Material Act that we're currently working on, and how to transform those industrial partnerships as vessel for how to understand climate resilience. Because the way that I understand the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and this is my biggest takeaway, is that Russia has understood that we are entering indeed in this fundamentally unstable period of human history, where macroeconomic stability is a thing of the past to an extent. Food security is a thing of the past. And Russia has targeted food, water, and energy as the main aspects of its war against Ukraine, but also more generally as a way to sort of strengthen its own resilience and self-sustainability in the future, and therefore its ability to position itself as a geoeconomic power broker. This is a lesson that we need to take in Europe, and that we need therefore to sort of work on in order to strengthen the foundations for food security, water security, and energy security, not just in Europe, but in Europe with partners going forward.
Thanks a lot. And already a lot of food for thought. But I will refrain from immediately starting to ask you questions and pass to Angelita, please.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Olivia, for your comment. Actually, and what I will be talking about, I'll also address some of these issues, and I'll try to make the connections to what you were just saying. Speaking about the questions for our session, I would mostly speak about the first two questions. So the environmental and climate impact of the war, and also what has been happening with Russia's climate policy since the beginning of the full-scale war in late February. So starting with the environmental and climate consequences of the war, the way I usually perceive them is that I divide them into two main categories. And the first category are the direct consequences of the war. And that is the immediate environmental impact that we see in Ukraine in the area of soil pollution, water pollution, chemical pollution, ecosystem destruction, biodiversity destruction. And so those, I would say, are direct consequences. I see, Ralph, you're actually holding a magazine in your hand, and that magazine is Environment and Law, the magazine which I also happen to edit. And in that magazine, we actually asked a group of Ukrainian environmentalists who do track such consequences to write a very detailed overview of these direct consequences, so to say. And there are also a number of international groups which are tracing down these consequences. One of these groups has been created under the auspices of the United Nations Environmental Programme, and there are many experts taking part in it. I also sometimes participate in these meetings. And there's also another group where I'm also involved in, and the group is called Ukraine War Environmental Consequences Work Group. It's a joint work group of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian experts and journalists, and we regularly monitor what's happening, and we also regularly publish publicly accessible articles about the both direct and indirect consequences. Now going to indirect consequences. I believe Olivia has already mentioned quite a few of them, including the food security. I would also obviously mention the energy security and the whole revamping of the energy sector as such. So what we see, I would say we as people coming from the climate background, we actually very much hope that the war will give a huge push for the decarbonization efforts, because we thought, look, this is such a sign that relying on just a handful of suppliers of fossil fuels is unsustainable. However, what we see does not quite happen according to that scenario, unfortunately. And what we see is that many countries are just going out and do their shopping for fossil fuels elsewhere. Many countries build LNG infrastructure. Many countries relaunch coal generation. Many countries also think of prolonging the nuclear generation. Still, the overall picture at the moment looks like that would be more of a short-term reaction, and the middle term and the long-term reaction would still be decarbonization and energy transition. There was a report by the International Energy Agency shortly before the COP27, the World Energy Outlook 2022, and International Energy Agency is a very conservative institution, but still their main argument was, in the end, even though the short-term consequences are let's buy it elsewhere, let's buy more and secure our fossil fuel storage, in the long term, it would still give a push to energy transition and to decarbonization and renewable energy investment. There are many other consequences from, for example, the global wood products market also changing, because like quite a number of sanctions on Russian supplies, but also once again, Russian exports going more towards Asia, and forest certification agencies going out of Russia. So there's a lot happening in forestry. There's a lot happening in mining industry. I think also Olivia mentioned that both with regard to the basic metals, including steel and aluminium, and rare metals and rare earth metals. I would actually make a very short connection to the COP27. I realize our next session will actually be dedicated to COP27. But while I was there a few weeks ago, I also noticed, for example, very strong presence of both Rosatom, who was very much engaging in public events with quite a number of representatives of the global South countries and trying to push for deeper cooperation with them. And likewise, the mining companies, the nickel companies, copper companies, which are also there saying, look, our metals are needed for the global energy transition. So why don't we think about lowering down trade barriers or sanctions, especially with those sectors? So just to refer to what you were saying. Now, probably to my second point, and that is what has been happening with Russia's climate agenda ever since the beginning of the full-scale war in late February. And here I would say we see action on two different levels. One level is a bureaucratic level, what is still happening in Russia. There's still new legislation being worked out. There's still a lot of events dedicated to decarbonization, ESG, companies doing something in the area of climate. Obviously, the international focus is now much more not on the so-called Western countries, but on other countries like Asia, Middle East. What are they doing? What are their requirements towards carbon disclosure and emissions disclosure and emission reduction and ESG in general? The Sakhalin experiment, so that's an experiment of the region in Far East Russia, which is aiming for net zero target by 2026, has been launched. I mean, once again, officially, like we'll have to see what happens there, especially after most of Western companies have left the region. So on one level, it all continues as if there is no war, right? So the ministries keep on working, the ministries keep on writing legislation, and we'll see that happening. On the other hand, if we do try and look beyond just the words and the papers, what's happening in reality, we do see that there is some rollback of predominantly environmental legislation. For example, in terms of standards, in terms of certification, vehicle standards have been rolled back like 20 years ago. Now in Russia, vehicles with the lowest environmental standards of Euro 0 can be produced. Likewise, standards for burning of flaring gas, for example. Likewise, standards of using oil and heavy oil for energy generation. So many standards have been lowering down, and quite a number of environmental legislation also in the area of environmental impact assessment with large infrastructure projects, in the area of the best available technologies introduction. So they either slowed down or rolled back. This all comes after repeated requests from the Russian business community, who keep saying, look, we work in such difficult economic conditions. We cannot now also have this environmental burden on us. So please no at the moment. And now probably the last point is the pure climate legislation have not been rolled back. Russia still has its long-term low carbon development strategy, which was adopted last year, 2021, shortly before the COP in Glasgow, which foresees Russia reaching net zero by 2060. This year, there was supposed to be a very detailed plan which would prescribe which sectors of economy are doing what in order to achieve this. Now, this plan has not appeared. It has been pushed for the next year. In a way, further legislation, as I said, in the area of climate adaptation, also like businesses disclosing their emissions, it's all coming into force. But another really big question, what will happen, well, first of all, to the Russian economy because of the sanctions and because of the global economic shift, and how will that subsequently influence Russia's emissions? And here there were two recent research scenarios which just appeared in Russia, like in the last couple of weeks. One was from the Russian Academy of Sciences, and it looked at the current level of technological sanctions on low carbon technologies, and it was trying to see to what extent it influences Russian decarbonization. And I think the main takeaway from that was that it does influence. It will probably slow down the rate of decarbonization like twice. So Russia, because of the lack of access to particular technologies, low carbon technologies, green technologies, Russia will have serious issues decreasing their emissions as much as they wanted to. If we just take purely that number, that will be like a half. But then, on the other hand, because the economic prospects are also somewhat unclear, and Russia may actually experience economic downturn, that in fact will also bring the emissions down. So in a way, it can compensate for the lack of technologies. It will be a very unsustainable way of decarbonizing the economy, but it might happen. And there was the second study. It was actually done by the Center of Energy Efficiency, and the head of the center, Igor Bashmakov, I believe he was also participating in our project. He's one of the IPCC experts, and he's usually one of the authors on chapter 3 of the IPCC reports on economic measures needed to be done. And so his recent scenarios also confirm that Russia's economy in the long run will shrink. Russia's population will decline even further. That will influence the emissions. The emissions will also go down, in many ways, repeating a historic path of the 90s. So what we had there, what is in the UN climate language is called hot air, we might experience it again. I'll probably stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot. I would like to invite Jana Sabanova for her comments.
Yeah, it works. Okay, so thanks a lot for these inputs. Makes my job easier because a lot of the issues have been touched upon. I really like that Olivia started with kind of describing the strategic vulnerabilities of the West. And I guess I would try to jump on the other side and try to talk about the strategic vulnerabilities of Russia that Russia has experienced in this war, obviously. And speaking about the sanctions, I mean, the first maybe point I wanted to make is that sanctions, it's not just the sanctions, it's not just the 8 packages of EU sanctions. I mean, it's the self-sanctioning voluntary of corporations. Over 1,000 companies have curtailed their activities in Russia. There's also the strategic redirection of the EU. The EU says by 2027, we will completely phase out imports of Russian fossil fuels. I mean, Russia is going to lose its most lucrative market. That's really, that's major. And Russia has not imploded, right? Because of the high hydrocarbon prices. So it's been able to accumulate the surplus. It doesn't import as much. It's been using kind of in stocks of different materials. But where are we heading? I mean, look at Russia. Basically, the share of the export-oriented industries will be falling. If you look at the steel company that was selling maybe to Europe, what they have to do now, they cannot sell to Europe. They have to reorient to Asia. That means working with the Russian railways, having a lot of logistical expenses. You have the strong ruble. It means your exports are actually more expensive. They're less competitive for the Asian consumers. And so in the end, these front runners of the Russian economy have had like zero revenue. I mean, it's a very difficult situation. What happens, even if you wanted to develop your decarbonization, you just have less resources to do that. And I think we shouldn't forget also the impact of the mobilization of the draft. I mean, hundreds of thousands of highly skilled workers have left Russia. That's a huge brain drain. I mean, it's one of the major blows to the economy. I think it's even maybe more than the sanctions, or it compounds the effects. And Angelina said that ESG and the climate policies are there, and it's true. But also, again, here we have like limited resources. So if you cannot sell your energy to Europe, you sell it to Asia, where India and China take a cut, they take a discount, you have less revenues. So even if you wanted to do something, you don't have access to technologies, you don't have access to international capital, and you don't have enough export revenues. So even if you wanted to do a lot, you're limited. And Russia does want to do, I think, kind of stay in this decarbonization stream just to be able to access Asian markets, because obviously they also have this agenda. And if we look at the front-runner groups, there were two before the war on like these climate issues and decarbonization. Basically, it was the foreign companies who had this decarbonization strategies corporate, so they would create like voluntary demand for renewable power, for example. And then there were the export-oriented companies. So one group is kind of gone. The second group has fewer resources. Also, like Olivia, that you mentioned the African outreach. When I was researching for this paper that was published yesterday, Rosatom was very active in Africa. And I think Rosatom is really trying to position itself in this anti-colonial discourse that, look, the West is just exploiting you Africans for your resources. We Russians, look at what we offer you. We offer you a nuclear power plant. We offer you technology. We train you specialists. We give you a loan, like a preferential loan. All of that as a package. We build your capacity, and that's what the West doesn't offer. So when you talk about industrial strategies, that Russia, I think, is very skillful at exploiting this discourse. And of course, it builds on the good Soviet-African ties. And so I think it's easy being in Europe and Germany, think that Russia is very isolated. It's not really isolated in the global South. And it's fighting very strongly against that. And maybe one more point, I don't know, I think I don't have that much more time. I think very interesting, also development in Turkey. Watch out for Turkey. Turkey has been very smart to position itself as a hub. Turkey is one of the main channels for parallel imports of technology. Turkey is used as a window for entities doing business with Europe, but kind of through Turkey. Turkey may become a gas hub. Okay, maybe it's like questionable, but still, they would be able to mix Russian gas and like mask it and maybe sell it to some European buyers who would be okay with buying that. Maybe one point where I didn't quite agree, or maybe I have a different like vision of Russia. Like you always spoke about Russia's like strategic and geostrategic goals, and I think it's true. But also we have to like really keep in mind the political economy in Russia, because I've been involved in this research for a few years now, and the groups that wage the war are not necessarily the ones who are promoting like ESG agenda in big corporations. It's just that this group took over, and now they want to promote technological development. But what do they want to do? They want to use maybe hydrogen to power drones to strike military targets. I mean, technological development can take different ways, right? And so finally, I would say that in terms of industrial strategy and import substitution, the crisis benefits the few Russia's high technology companies. Rosatom, definitely there. They're also trying to produce storage system, lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. Why are electric vehicles good? Because you're not as dependent actually compared to the normal internal combustion engines on Western imports, on Western technologies. It's easier to make an electric vehicle. That's why I think this part might be developing in Russia. And finally, the permafrost. I think that's the issue where the Russian government is really concerned. Why? Because the resource extraction infrastructure is located in Arctic areas. So that's like a huge source of economic damage, the climate impact, the melting permafrost. So I think that's an issue that's going to be on the agenda. Yeah, Joe, some thoughts. I think there's so much more to discuss.
Thanks a lot. That was quite a rich menu. Nora, would you like to join our discussion?
Sure.
As a substitute, I have to say.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I will actually also just try to make some additional comments to the inputs we heard, which were quite fruitful. So one thought and comment on the inputs we already heard was that I think Germany, and obviously Germany is always in our understanding a part of the European Union, with all of the distraction we see by Russia, especially with their aggression in the Ukraine, it's important to keep track on our narrative on a democratic society and the energy and renewables transition we have been starting and we will be going. And I do want to believe that this is a narrative which is at the end more attractive to other partners around the world to join. And so everything we heard, also the strategic mingling in different African countries, I think Germany and the EU could do good to actually come in and offer modern partnerships, different partnerships compared to partners as Russia as we see, but also to refer to our history differently than we had done in the past. That, to be honest, will take time because it takes trust building foremost. It takes more time to figure out which values do we share with such partners, and then how could partnerships look like, right? But Germany with the new government has taken a path to offer, in addition to all the efforts taken within the international community, with the COPs, with the UN level on fighting climate change, in addition to bring climate and energy partnerships and start conversations with bilateral countries. And I do want to mention that we do intend to offer such partnerships, especially to a country like India, because again, India also has, let's say, had its different stakes with different partnerships, including Russia. So again, I think we should do good to take time and negotiations with a country like India, offer an alternative model. It's also important to remember that India will host the G20 next year. So again, also has a crucial role in that. And I think I also want to throw in everything we heard about renewables and the different technologies out there, that the European Union has said it's part of pathway to show there is a lot of innovation needed, and countries cannot just do a little bit of transformation, right? You have to keep track. Policies have to be long term, and still sets a model, and that's why I do think that other countries do see that more on a long term as attractive, and also for their societies to be more sustainable, right? And like a story of modern societies and building on democratic values. And then it's also about the question of ownership, because when we think of Russia, how they economically work, right, it's mainly based on monopolies. And I think what we have also experienced with it in Europe by taking the path of a transition is that we diversified our industries and technologies. So I think I keep it to that for now.
Thanks a lot. I would like to start our conversation and maybe in remark to our participants online. You can start to ask questions via the chat. With a question to Olivia, if I got you right, conclusions the Russian leadership is drawing from the war and the rift with the West is not so much to change their business model. Maybe they even more try to keep that status as a fossil fuel superpower, a raw material superpower, a nuclear technology superpower. and becoming an agricultural superpower with the resources they want to conquer in Ukraine, but to diversify their trade relations. Yeah, to switch now from especially the EU to Asia, Brazil, other Latin American countries, African countries. So, what is your expectation? Will that work? Could they really substitute or replace, especially the technological cooperation with the West, by these new partners? When I'm getting it right, all the expectations that China would step in and would offer an alternative to especially technology cooperation with the West didn't fulfill. There is no increase in China's investment since the beginning of the war. The other way around, it looks like China is only interested in cheap fossil fuels and other raw materials. So what do you think? Will this strategy play out?
I think that Russia had it in its mind when it started the war that it could ride the system's rivalry wave, and that indeed there was an element of its partnership with China that was going to play in its favor if Russia was successful also in Ukraine, which it hasn't been.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the differences, because there are many between Russia and China in terms of the systems rivalry approach, China is a lot more systematic, a lot more structured, a lot more sort of playing on a number of different playing fields. Russia is a rogue actor. It's been using the power of rogue disruption in a number of different contexts, such as the African ones, and using now wars of aggression towards Ukraine, and using, disinformation, misinformation in different contexts to try and sort of turn the ship in its favor. So there are some things on which it is successful. For example, misinformation, disinformation, flipping narratives, exactly as you were saying, in terms of engaging with the global south and trying to turn geopolitics of perception in its favor. When I was in Madagascar, for example, over the summer, I was really astonished to see how Madagascar has become a misinformation and disinformation bubble for Russia, and how, even though Madagascar is a country that suffers the ills of energy inflation and food insecurity, it was still sort of, falling into this trap of blaming Europe and the sanctions for the price hike rather than the actual war of aggression towards Ukraine. But in terms of becoming a superpower in the future of energy dependencies, I see a lot more of a nuanced picture. So I see a potential for competition with Russia on the nuclear question, as you're saying, because there is a sort of historical competency in Russia on this. There may be a different sort of picture at play since yesterday with the announcement of the fusion, sort of innovation coming from the US, and we'll have to see if it sort of, plays into the future of climate policy and certain partnerships that play out on nuclear partnerships between the US or with other partners around the world. On the CRM question, I don't see Russia becoming a superpower at all. I think that it has a very strong competitive advantage due to its natural endowment on quality ore in terms of nickel, palladium, and vanadium. I see an ability of Russian actors to try and gain access to deposits in Africa or Central Asia, and then sort of trying to play this positioning in terms of an actor that other actors need to go through in order to do extraction, in order to do, processing to a certain extent. Will it rival with China, or even with the future of industrial, ecosystems in the US and in Europe, I'm not quite sure, because there is an element of technological development there. And we're effectively seeing a Russia, as your title suggests, which has sort of cut itself from the future of technological ecosystems as a result of the war, even from China for that matter. So I think that there was an element of ambition. I don't think that Russia will have the means of its ambitions towards the CRM question going forward. In terms of its ability to redistribute and strengthen sort of fossil dependencies, I think that there is a possibility there towards Asian partners, towards African partners, particularly on the oil question. But that plays on a number of different factors that are very difficult to predict themselves. One is, well, the ability of the European Union and a number of other partners to approach, countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, with those JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and really sort of delivering on them and therefore reducing the demand for fossil fuels from a global perspective. And that's the sort of systems rivalry approach in terms of indirect and diffuse strategies, really pushing or doubling down on approaches towards renewables in partnerships with other countries, and therefore reducing the ability essentially of Russia to have a market for its products. Mm-hmm. And I think that it also depends on a number of other sort of decisions that will be made by countries in Africa, particularly around their own sort of growth patterns and trajectories, and whether or not they want to depend on fossil fuels. So there is European agency, there is transatlantic agency, there is a lot of agency also coming from countries themselves in the so-called global south in terms of how Russia will be able to play its cards. On the agricultural question, I see a bit more of an agency on the part of Russia to play on destabilization, and that will remain the main card that Russia will play. Weaponizing vulnerability and sort of harvesting vulnerabilities in countries that are politically and economically unstable. And I will just end on one thing, because connecting to that, this is one of the reasons why the COP27 conversation has been so important on the Bridgetown agenda, on the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, because the more there is delivery on, this question of debt restructuring, rethinking the patterns and trajectories and modeling of economic growth in countries that are suffering from, stunted growth and multiple shocks coming their way, the less Russia will be able essentially to sort of harvest discontent, disappointment, structural failures of the international system to deliver on resilience and development for countries that will be the most vulnerable. So again, trying to sort of strengthen as much as possible the solidarity at the international level and the structural ability to sort of move towards an energy transition will be the key aspects of how European agency can play out.
Yeah, I find quite convincing to describe the current Russian regime as power of disruption. I think the speculation in the Kremlin is that they will benefit from chaos. Yeah, the more chaos and more instability, the better. To overthrow what they call the US-dominated international order. So the West has to develop a counter strategy to prevent these effects, especially in the global South. Any direct comments to that? Yeah, Jana, please.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting to think about the broader trends as well in the world. And I think comparing to when I went to university, like late 90s, early 2000s, there was still this belief in kind of the benefits of globalization and kind of the positive, the non-zero sum game that we have like these international institutions, global trade, we all benefit. But look at what's happened now. I mean, going just also beyond Russia. We say the West, but I mean, if we look at the US policy and like the recently adopted Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of protectionist measures, a lot of attempts to kind of build up on their positions of asymmetric power projection. So challenging China, of course, more or less, then China would respond. Also, the EU is now trying to challenge the Inflation Reduction Act as being non-compliant with the WTO rules. The WTO is more or less dysfunctional. I mean, we see kind of that the order is not functioning as well as it used to. And I think it's a big problem for the global energy transformation, because the global energy transformation cannot happen if countries isolate, if they really seek their own advantage in the geoeconomic world picture. I mean, we depend on global supply chains. We depend on the innovation that's being done alongside the supply chains. If the US says we're going to produce semiconductors, we're going to produce solar panels, like, it doesn't benefit the global climate transition. And so I think I see it as part also of a big challenge. So climate change is a collective action dilemma. We all have to contribute. But we see leading powers actually seeking their own advantage. And I'm not sure that's really conducive. So, and I think that if you listen to Ursula von der Leyen's speech a couple of days ago, I mean, that comes very clearly, out there. Like, we don't agree diplomatically with the US approach on that. We have to think differently of different forms of cooperation.
Thanks. Angelina, a question to you. What do you think is finally the balance sheet of Western sanctions regarding the revenue for the Russian government? Is there kind of paradoxy now playing out, shrinking volumes of especially fossil fuels export, but rising prices? So finally, the financial revenues are not really reduced?
Well, it's as you pointed right, it's a rather complex situation. On one hand, direct and indirect sanctions and self-sanctions, numerous attempts to redirect deliveries to the east, lower prices of most Russian resources when they're being sold to the east, but then growing global prices. So I would say we have to take at least 3 of these components into account and then get the statistics for the year. Like, we don't have it as of now. So we'll have to see to what we come in the end of the year. So far, I think the way it looks is that, at least the export part of the Russian economy has not really been impacted to such an extent by the sanctions as many thought. But then it was truly most the import part of the Russian economy, which was more influenced by the sanctions. I think the latest data which I saw from the Russian Economic Development Ministry is that Russia's GDP will probably shrink by between 3% and 4% this year. It's not a lot, like comparing with the kind of wave of sanctions, right? The 8 tranches of sanctions. And it's also a question whether we can believe official statistics now coming out of Russia. That's another point. But overall, I would say, I think the conclusion in short is that the impact of sanctions has really been maybe less than expected. But on the other hand, if we think about access to technologies, issues with import, it will come, but it will just come later, and maybe in a less direct way than we tend to think.
So sanctions will not be an decisive weapon to end the war, but to weaken strategically Russia's ability to wage further wars.
Well, it's a bit hard to say now. I think from my understanding, and also from what Olivia was saying a lot, and also all the other colleagues, I also believe a lot will depend on the behavior of other actors, including the large actors like China or India or Turkey. And also whether Turkey will continue to be, on one hand, a hub for Russian gas globally, and on the other hand, a hub for Western technologies for coming to Russia through parallel import. So I think a lot will depend on them. Also, a lot will depend on the other countries, including Global South countries, and like how successful is Russia developing cooperation with them, or will other regions of the world offer more lucrative path of development. And then there's always a room for the unexpected to happen. I would say it like this.
Mm-hmm. Would you expect the brain drain to go on?
There've been already a number of waves of migration out of Russia. Even before the beginning of the full-scale war, there was an ongoing wave. I mean, it was a slow one, but there was one. And then we experienced one wave in February, March, another wave September, October, exactly. And there are various estimations of how many people have left. I've seen figures from 800,000 to 2 million. But then it's like the statistics is not super reliable. But I mean, this is the figures I've seen from various sources. From my understanding, like some of the people also went back, especially from the second wave, following the attempts to secure that like the draft is done. We're not taking any more people. So some of the people who went on a very emotional wave, so to say, they went back, especially from the countries like Kazakhstan or Georgia. But then the professional wave, the wave of people with from the IT sector, from creative industries, startup scene, many of them just take more time to get prepared and leave. And I almost have a feeling that will continue, maybe slower, much slower than what we experienced before. This is already something being realized in Russia, and I believe in the last few days there was a lot of discussion on how Russian companies, mainly IT companies, but not only, might prohibit the employees to work from abroad. And so, yeah, we'll have to see where that will take us to.
So, in the final minutes of our first panel, I would like to invite our audience to step in. There's some very knowledgeable people here around and also online. Any questions or comments? We have a microphone moving around, please. And introduce yourself briefly when you take the floor.
Lucas. Yeah, Boris Schneider from Clean Energy Wire, and also incidentally one of the co-hosts of Angelina's podcast that you introduced. Thanks for the very interesting panel. I have a question regarding the technology kind of problem, or the technology transfer question. You said all that neither China nor anybody else managed to replace Europe so far. Do you think it's because they don't want to, or is it just not possible? I mean, could the technology come from somewhere else, or is there really no plan B?
Would you like to respond, Jana?
Yeah,
please.
Can have a go. I think when you talk about technologies, it's also important to really differentiate what we exactly talk about. So, for example, Russia doesn't produce its own gas turbines. And so they used to get them from Germany, from other countries. Now they have an issue. They don't produce them. So, for example, they can buy them from Iran. But then you just buy a gas turbine from Iran. So it's good, you have it. But Russia has been kind of trying to aim at technology transfer. Now that's a whole different story. I mean, that means you create manufacturing capacities at home. That means a new company comes and they really build capacity and the technology is transferred. So you have your own potential in the country. I think that's very difficult. And that was what Europe has been offering in many cases to Russia. For example, in the renewable energy sector, in the wind power sector, Vestas and Siemens Gamesa had manufacturing facilities in Russia, right? And so I think this is very difficult. And that's something that China is not interested in doing, because Russia is a small market. But China is, of course, interested in selling technologies. Yeah, sure, why not? We sell our stuff if it's possible. So I think it also depends. Like some parts come from parallel imports. For example, I heard in the machine, some machines are imported from Belarus. Maybe they're less reliable. there are different ways to source technology. But I think if you really look at technology transfer and building capacity in Russia, that's going to be difficult. I mean, that's really not there.
Mm-hmm. Other question comes, please, Angelina.
I actually have a question to my co-panelist. I found it really interesting how you mentioned the importance of Germany and other European Union countries to come up with a new narrative, which will be interesting to many other parts of the world, and which goes just beyond the technological narrative. Actually, coming back from COP27 in Egypt, I came back in a rather, I would say, concerned or even sad mood, seeing many negative trends not happening in the region we are talking about, but also in many other countries all over the world, including Egypt, including Indonesia. And here, I mean, further crackdown on civil society, on media, along with an interest in technological development and even decarbonization and even renewable energy. So many of these countries do look up, well, I would not say they look up for Russia, but they certainly look up for China's example, right? How one can be technologically advanced and yet have everything under control. So what can you offer against that model to a country where, or countries where much is being controlled by political elites and there's not so much free room to play? Maybe it sounds a bit too general, but I would like for us to think about it and like dream about it. And I was wondering what you were thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not as easy, right? Coming as the European Union and selling the nice green, democratic green narrative. No, it's not. And it starts with being fair of what's the situation and the livelihood situation of people in different countries, right? I would have taken the short answer would have been, well, we unfortunately see a lot of bad governance in many areas around the world. And yet probably the governments are not our partners, but the hope would be on the broader civil society to demand change within their own country / their governments. But again, then we have to acknowledge this is way harder if you have to, and that's again, our department is now working exactly on acknowledging not only do we face climate change as a threat to the whole world, but we see a lot of diverse security issues in that, right? And acknowledging if people, again, we heard a lot about the new security threat is access to water and food. And if we acknowledge these people are already having an issue to feed themselves, then it's like, not even romantic, but just unrealistic of me saying we just have to take a little longer time to build trust and offer a new other modern narrative. I'm aware, right? But again, then my response is, okay, let's try to first offer new access to food and help by partnerships where we find willing governments, at least, who are interested in renewing their own production of food to be more independent. I'm not saying completely by tomorrow, but more independent again, grow their own food to some extent, guarantee water access, at least in a bigger region, right? Sometimes it cannot happen in one country, but also enable them to partner up within a bigger region, talking about several African regions. So again, where there's bad governance, it's hard. But then just now that the US hosted this US-African conference, there was again a big climate catastrophe, and the president of Namibia, being a governing president, took on the floor and made the stake of saying, we see again climate change is threatening my country, and we have to talk real here now. So I see with all the governments who are more sympathetic with authoritarian systems, I give that to you, but I also do see now more and more bold governance, including their civil society, to actually speak up. And what Olivia described, that unfortunately, right, for us, and again, I think that's now on us as European countries to take our history really on words and talk about it, right? And I think when I say let's offer a new partnership, I think the first step is actually to acknowledge our history with colonialism and address that. And hopefully from there, we can talk about a future partnership, right? But I do see, again, a lot of speaking up within several countries where we didn't see so much empowerment in the past. And so there is a lot changing. And I think the COP, for everything which it may have not delivered, it delivered on countries which have not taken a voice so far in UN context, have taken a first step to take the space also for their own. But yeah, it's not it's complex.
Very challenging topic. Maybe for a long time, we, say Western liberals, underestimated that quite a relevant part of the elites in the global South are intrigued by a model of authoritarian modernization, including opening channels for kleptocracy and corrupt enrichment. So, to make the alternative model attractive, this is quite a challenge. Without including civil societies, I think it will not work as an only kind of elitist cooperation. And at the same time, this is raises really serious questions to ourselves, to Western politics. Are we really ready to engage globally? Are we really ready to invest in the development of the poor world? And are we ready at the same time to boost our own economic dynamics? Yeah, when Europe is seen as a kind of lame duck economically, what is the attractivity for others? Yeah, so this also sometimes is a contradiction in the environmental community. If you listen to the degrowth people and so, kind of slow it down and degrowth, and so. This is not the answer.
Just a two-finger reaction on what you were saying, Nora, and you as well, Ralph. I think indeed we need to approach this notion of partnership and relationships with countries, particularly in Africa, vastly differently. It starts, ironically, by sort of being, I think, a lot more nuanced in how we talk about authoritarianism versus democracy. And the danger is essentially of corruption and co-optation of elite bargains, including in our countries, right? We have to sort of be also very, very clear about the fact that we're facing really important challenges, which are being harvested themselves by countries such as Russia, and which are being also planted by specific people, including people like Prigozhin. But we have to be, I think, the interesting thing, I think, about the current situation and the fallout of the war and the enduring consequences, which are going to be with us for a really long time, is that it's going to offer a very strong mirror to Europe about what we need to look into in terms of strengthening of our own governance, about coherence, and therefore about the type of partnership and sort of relationship level playing field that we need to have with actors in Africa and other regions of the world, middle power to middle power. And I think that there's been a hubris for a long time in the European Union, despite of very genuine and strong attempts to relate differently with African partners. There's still been a hubris, which is we do things better in terms of governance, in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency and things like this. We have to look very strongly in the mirror around this. We also have to look at our own incoherence, and that was very, very strong at COP27 indeed, where fingers were being pointed at Europe, particularly on the gas question. There was a very, very strong civil society component coming from Africa saying, don't gas Africa. There were some fantastic reports, actually, which came out saying, we Africans want to sort of not leapfrog, but sort of jump over the fossil sort of, part of our development. And yet, indeed, if you look at the way in which fossil contracts are being locked in African coasts, it's mostly Shell and Total and, a number of European companies. So all of these sort of incoherences are being, thrown back at Europe saying, you want us to sort of, you want the global south to move forward, but at the same time, there's a lot of scrambling and incoherences and stuff like this. So we're going to have to approach this notion of partnership with this sense of what do we need to change at home as well? It's not just what we need to offer, it's how we need to change our own metabolism from an economic and political perspective to really move forward and offer a different type of global system and institutional governance, political and economic and financial perspective.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll leave it with that in our first round. I found it an interesting move in our conversation, starting with Russia and ending with the West. And I think there's some truth in that, because Russia and also China and others, they are extremely smart in exploiting the weaknesses of our democratic systems. So we have to make liberal democracy great again to counter that challenge. With that, I would like to leave you to send you in a coffee break. We will continue 5:50 with the next round. Please. Thank you, and hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much to our speakers. Our panelists to join me at the stage, Herr Hams, Nora, and is Jens Siegert online? Could we see him at the screen? Aische? Ist Jens online? Wir sollten ihn hier auf dem Bildschirm haben.
Ja, ich bin hier, aber kann mein Video.
We should see him on the screen. I'm here, but I can't launch my video.
So we are just discussing. Here he is. Hello, Jens. So welcome to our final round. It's more or less a continuation of the first panel, but now the focus is on the question if and under which preconditions and circumstances any kind of revival of climate cooperation with Russia is even thinkable, I would say, both in terms of government cooperation, but also private business engagement in and with Russia. I'm happy that we have 4 very sophisticated speakers for this topic. I will start with our first speakers, Nora Löhle. You know her already from the first panel. Since some weeks, member of the department and senior advisor to the Department for Climate and Security in the Foreign Office, and with a long experience in transatlantic relations and climate policy based in Washington. Jens Siegert, journalist and political analyst. We know each other even longer. Jens is living since 1993 in Moscow. Initially as a correspondent for German Broadcasting, then from 1999 to 2015, a very long period, he was the director of the Moscow office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Then he was the director of the EU project on public diplomacy. And Jens is also a long-term friend and advisor to Memorial Moscow, which, as you know, was just awarded with the Nobel Prize for Peace. And Jens was part of the ceremony in Oslo. Welcome, Jens. Then we will have two additional comments from Arshak Makhichian. He is one of the outstanding young environmental activists in Russia, member of Fridays for Future. Had to leave Russia after the beginning of the war and is now living in Berlin. Welcome. And last but not least, also say a long-term dialogue partner of ours, Michael Harms. He is the, what will you say, managing director of a very famous business group in Germany, the Eastern Committee of the German Industry. Very much disputed over the last years because so they had been perceived, let me say, though, as a kind of Russia lobby in the not only German business community, but now with a very interesting turn after the beginning of the war. I found a quote of Michael Harms in an interview he gave to the Deutsche Welle. He said, there is no doubt in the necessity of sanctions against Russia, and the German business community is univocally condemning the Russian war against Ukraine. And I have to say, Michael Harms personally was always a supporter of Russian civil society, also in his long term as the director of the German-Russian Chamber of Commerce in Moscow. So thanks for joining us again. Maybe I would like to start with Nora Löhle. I don't know, Nora, how close you followed the climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I would be very much interested in getting a little bit deeper assessment in how Russia was acting at this conference. I hope you could say something on that. And then, of course, it's up to you which aspects you want to pick up in your remarks. Please.
All right. So I will start and say I can't, on my own, share any observations how Russia acted at the COP, because I myself wasn't there. But obviously we had many colleagues from the Foreign Office being in Sharm el-Sheikh, and what they had reported, specifically looking at Russia and how they acted, was very little. But the little they said was they seemed rather neutral and were, one could say, surprisingly not as counterpartive as one would expect by now, right? And that's actually true for the last couple of years. Again, Russia never has been an ally on climate ambition, but on a COP level, either the most disruptive partner either. So that's observation to be shared. I think Angelina actually was very well able to already share some more of the climate and energy policy and strategies within Russia earlier on. And I found it fascinating because it is actually quite hard if you don't have like an expert like her, which there's very few, to get such insights. What we at the Foreign Office, and that goes beyond the COP processes, and again, that's really the little I can share this observation by our colleagues. And I will add, we do not expect that keeps being their same strategy. Like, obviously, one should always expect, depending which government we will have in place in the future in Russia, that they will play a different, either more constructive or even less so constructive role. But clearly it is important to say that Russia doesn't deliver so far on its national climate targets. They don't deliver on contributing to international climate finance. And obviously, when we look at UN processes, those are the tools everyone agreed on. And again, they do not deliver. As a second and more very broadly spoken some kind of sphere, we obviously, as German government, engage on a constant base at the UN level. And there, Russia has been in the past always a very difficult and uncomfortable partner to engage with. The last resolution, we with many other partners who supported that, a UN resolution on climate and security. So finally acknowledging that there is a lot of climate change induced conflicts where we see only the UN as really the global community could act in the needed way, because it really affects many regions in the world already to a devastating part. We see lots of famines happening at the same time already. And again, they are not only, but to a big extent and more also induced and expeded by climate change. And again, so we as the German government see only the UN could act on that in the needed way. And Russia was one of the few countries who was against that resolution. So that was unsuccessful, which then, just to explain, that means that the UN by now doesn't have an official mandate to act on this, let's say, double challenge, security and climate change at the same time. At the same time, I thought I'd try to share at least one example where we see at least a tiny surprising moment where Russia was supportive of within the OECD. Where Russia is a member. Last year, exactly 1 year ago, the, how is it called in English? Ministerial Council decision was made. So again, that's a body of the OSCE. How is it called in English? OECD. On climate, and that was acknowledged by all partners, including Russia, which now means that the OECD will come up with a bigger and broader strategy on climate. And as that is an organization which mainly covers security aspects, it will not be a strategy which will fight climate change so much, but at least take part of all sorts of adaptation measurements in the future. And they actually just published, as one of the outcomes of this ministerial decision decided last year, a big study on tipping points. And that is actually a big deal now, because that study does show that we
have, and that really refers to policymakers, as the member states have to expect some tipping points happening way earlier than expected due to climate change. And so one will at least expect Russia being still part of that space to react on that and act within that space. So yeah, I guess I leave it by those first thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Nora. If you allow it, a direct response and question, I found it very interesting that you use the term that Russia has been a difficult partner in terms of the climate policy. This was, I would say, the general attitude of the term Russia policy, to see Russia as a kind of difficult partner. Now, I think Olaf Scholz clearly explained that in his famous Zeitenwende speech. We are in another state of enlightenment, that Russia is no longer a difficult partner, but a full-fledged adversary to the EU and the liberal democracies in Europe. So what do you think, or what is the official position of the foreign ministry and the government? Could there be kind of a sectoral cooperation with Russia, sectoral engagement with Russia in the area of climate policy, while we in the same time are in a full confrontation in almost all other areas?
No. No. But the space where we where Russia, in our view, should still be a part is the UN space. And then if we see, again, processes like the COP being spaces where we try to fight climate change on an international level, I would say, right, we are sort of in a climate debate with Russia, acknowledging they still belong to the United Nations, and they do. But I mean, your question really sounded like a bilateral collaboration on climate, maybe industrial, and there is a no. I mean, we are seeing a war. It's an aggression. They're doing every day since February in the Ukraine, and until this war hasn't ended, which would mean fully leaving the Ukrainian territory, it would definitely need a serious peace agreement. And I think we are all aware this would be a process of years. I don't see any collaboration with Russia, right? But again, I'm
okay.
with the UN level.
Yeah. It's an interesting differentiation. Thanks. Jens, maybe also you are, of course, an observer in Russia, but maybe more from the Russian angle. How do you see is now the Russian government playing with this climate card? Yeah, are they using it as a kind of diplomatic tool to escape sanctions and to present themselves as a partner in global governance? And what is the state of those? I don't know if you had been present in the beginning of our small conference when I was explaining the start of our project, which was very much encouraged by what we would call some Russian liberals who thought that the area of climate policy and ecological modernization could become a catalytic factor for the economic modernization of Russia and also for some political reforms. Are these people still there? And what is now their domestic situation? Please.
Ja, vielen Dank. Mir ist gesagt worden, dass ich Deutsch reden soll, dass das besser sei.
You can, if you
Ja,
wish.
mir wurde sogar gesagt, dass ich soll, weil das
I
besser
was told to speak German because it's better when I speak German, and I'm much more comfortable when I speak German. So basically, I can just repeat what has been said several times already in this panel. I think we have to adjust ourselves that for a foreseeable period, Russia will not be a partner for anything, not a partner and let alone a partner for action. So not in the sense of any partnership or cooperation. Everything, really everything is just under the preservation of the war. And that also goes for the liberals, which you just mentioned, Ralph. Before that, they did not have much of a say in many aspects, but they had, let's say, minor possibilities and rooms and spaces where they were allowed to act in a certain way. So, how to say, just to make a bit of money. There was a Russian politologist, Vladimir Gelman from St. Petersburg, who said Russia's political elite is divided between small green men, those which produce green paper, and those who spend green paper. The green men were the green liberals, and the other ones were the militaries, the security apparatus, and others. And all that has now aggravated much more. There is nothing which is not considered under the aspect of war. The conditions for any kind of taking up again any form of cooperation that has been said several times already is very clear. It is as clear as Russia under Putin is unacceptable. Ukraine must be free and Putin must be gone. So that is why I can't see presently that there is any kind of possibility to make any forecast for any strategy in the climate business. That will be all erratic, and sometimes perhaps there might be a windows of opportunity, but that's it already, not more and nothing beyond that. So the fact that the situation within Russia, as this situation is concerned, we do see, though, that there is an increasing number of problems of the economy that has been mentioned already. The economy is shrinking this year. Certainly, it will be not shrinking as much as forecast. That is mainly due to the high gas and other energy prices. There are issues. There is also some certain unwillingness in the country, but there is nothing which points to in any way deteriorate the stability of the regime in the foreseeable future. So big parts of the population are following Putin's justification of the war, not necessarily with enthusiasm, not necessarily actively, but they are basically in agreement with his statement that it's not a war against Ukraine. That really would be unpopular in the country, but it's really a fight with the West, namely a fight which for decades in some narratives, or has been even going on for decades and for centuries. So it's actually the idea of the West to keep Russia small or to destroy it altogether. And there are some reasons how it happened. That starts with the Russian Revolution, which had been organized by the West, the Russian General Staff. So the Western allies did also not act on time they wanted to bleed the Russia at the time, then, or the Soviet Union at the time. Then Russia started a big gesture of understanding by dissolving the Soviet Union. That's the present interpretation of many people. And Warsaw Pact was dissolved, and instead the West did not want to honor this. and instead extended NATO further to the east. And that is so that Putin can't do otherwise but attack Ukraine, because otherwise the West would develop the Ukraine into a border, or into a, let's say, fortress against Russia. So according to this narrative, Russia is the victim of the West and not the other way around. So in this view, only the West can end the war by depriving Ukraine from its original destination and giving it back to the so-called Russian world. That is the narrative altogether, and it's also the mood in the population. But at the same time, in particular, in the view of military success of Ukraine with the support of the West, and perhaps since summer, and also increasingly since partly mobilization of or in Russia, there was some apathy noticeable, also with some apocalyptic features. So whether that will bring Putin closer to his end, or this is not sure, it may tend into one or the other side. Presently, apathy is prevailing and retreat into the private sphere. So one is trying to save oneself or friends or sons from recruitment, but that's it already. There is no sign of any important collective outrage or fight against this authoritarian regime. That is different than, for instance, in Iran. Of course, there may be one incident which may trigger kind of turmoil, but this is nothing which can be planned in any way. So whether, nevertheless, of this sinister picture, there is also the possibility to influence the Russian climate policy and energy policy, especially from the West or from German, I would give you a rather Russian answer. In principle, yes, but that actually means no. Putin has compensated the lack of success with climate change and hydrogen sales by the Ukrainian war. So this does not play any role in the public discourse right now. For him, one could only bring Putin back to this success by offering him success in the war, and this is not possible. And so I don't see any room for any kind of institutionalized or any kind of cooperation with institutions of the Russian state. That does not mean, and I come back to the windows of opportunity, that there might not be small level cooperation. That may happen indeed, but that's it already. There is no reliability at all. And again, let me really point this out once more. On the Russian side, everything is subject to the condition of the war, and Angelina already gave you some examples for that. What else might be done still in spite of this situation? There are two things. One is that in any case, we should not only do so in the climate discussion, and it goes for everything which has to do with Russia. We should prepare ourselves for the time after. 30 years ago, we were not prepared actually for the time after. So we always should think this and keep it in mind. So when the end comes, whatever it might look like, from the situation of today, we should be ready, and we should have a concept in our sleeve. So, and the second is we have to be able, and being able is a rather complicated thing, because it's also a matter of political repression in Russia. So that means that there will be less or even no people still remaining in Russia, including the liberal part of the population. If they are still in Russia, they may be consulting you, but any cooperation is unthinkable in my mind as of today, simply that. And also because of the big risks these people would take. So what remains are the people in exile who are now leaving the country, maybe also people who travel outside. There are people who are still remaining in Russia, but from time to time also go to the West. And those are the people we should cooperate with or plan things and look what access might they have already in Russia, and we should not forget them in no case. So help and cooperation for people in exile is actually the best we can do and what I can see.
Thank you very much, Jens.
Maybe I should repeat briefly his main thesis. He sees no opportunity at all for a revival of any official cooperation with the Russian government. Also, no real opportunities for private businesses under the current political framework. But he says, let's look for any potential support and cooperation with the remaining civil society in Russia and the Russian diaspora, and let's prepare for a future after Putin or beyond Putin. Would you agree with that analysis? And representing the young environmental activists generation in Russia, what do you think? What could we do under these circumstances to, I would say, keep the spirit alive in the movements you are representing? Please.
Yeah, from the first day of the war, I was demanding an embargo for fossil fuels from Russia, and I was demanding it from Russia. And we do not have embargo for fossil fuels yet. Yeah, so you are continuing to your partnership with Russia. If we should tell the truth, yeah, you're paying more to Russia. Europe is paying more to Russia than to Ukraine, and yeah. This cooperation goes beyond fossil fuels. Also, yeah, on European level, there is a lot of cooperation with Rosatom in France, especially, of course, and in some other countries. And if we are talking about cooperation with Russian civil society, yes, of course, I think that we should continue work together. And I was saying on my interviews, like 3 years ago, that you shouldn't trust Putin. Yeah, but anyway, European governments, they were continuing to negotiate with Russian governments to have different kind of projects together, like Nord Stream and many others, and they were ignoring us, Russian civil society, and it was always strange for me. And like, I'm here in Germany, like, I don't know, for 9 months or something like that, and I had no meetings with German politicians. Yeah, they do not want to listen to Russian civil society. They are not brave. Yeah, they are not brave enough to lead these great countries, because European politicians they're waiting for answers, for miracles to happen, and they do not want to really act. Yeah. If we would have embargo for Russian fossil fuels from the first day of the war, as we were demanding, then we wouldn't have a war now. And this energy crisis, we wouldn't have this energy crisis. It was a strategic mistake for European countries. And Russian civil society is trying to continue its fight, and the situation for them is worsening. Like my friends from 42 movement in Arkhangelsk region, they were doing very important work. They were declared foreign agents, and they were declared foreign agents with these new foreign agent laws. And yeah, their life will be very difficult. And of course, they need more help. And many other people who are staying in Russia, they are heroes, and they deserve all kind of help. And yeah, also all my friends from anti-war movements and some other movements, they are having also troubles abroad. They are having a lot of troubles with their visas, and they are spending more time on solving these problems than on activism. And it's also, it shouldn't be like that, yeah. And yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to do something together. We have to work also in not just in Russia, but also in other countries. Yeah, with like post-Soviet countries, yeah, in the whole region, because yeah, there are a lot of comments that Turkey is continuing to have business with Russia, but also Europe should to do more work. I think in post-Soviet countries, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and yeah, we have to do climate actions also in there. It's very important because yeah, Ukraine is starting to in this war. Most likely they will return their lands at some point, but then we will have Putin at power. And yeah, from the beginning of this war, I was saying that it was a mistake for them to start this war, but he cannot give up. Yeah, he doesn't have any options, so he's continuing to fight. He will continue to fight Europe till we will stop him. So there is no choice for you, yeah, because Russia has nuclear power, Russia has a lot of things, and there is no choice like to do nothing. Yeah, a lot of European organizations, they do not want to work with Russian people because we are kind of toxic and we all connected to this regime. But yeah, European hands, they are not clean. Yeah, you were buying gas, you were financing Russian regime for decades, and it's also your responsibility to help us to stop Putin. Yeah, like all this surveillance in Moscow was implemented by help from European countries, and yeah, so of course it's not a question for me like should we do something together or not. And also I see very frustrating trends in Europe also, like they had searches at last generation activists places yesterday or 2 days ago in Germany. Yeah, they are peaceful climate activists. They didn't do anything. They broke some laws, but they did it in purpose to get some attention to the climate crisis. And now they are having searches. And the same thing was happening 20 years ago in Russia. Some radical people were saying, oh, we shouldn't work with this government, we shouldn't trust them. And people were saying, you're insane. And the Russian government was repressing them, and they started to repress the most radical people 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And then they started to repress like less radical people like Navalny, and then they started to repress people like me, and they like deprived me of my only citizenship. So yeah, so there are a lot of frustrating trends also in Europe.
Okay, thanks a lot. Just want to pick up two topics from your remarks. The first, I fully agree that it's hard to digest that there's still no, I would say, general provision for visas for Russian activists and people from the democratic civil society are now forced into exile. As we know, and we are engaged in these issues, it's still a battle one by one for every single young refugee to get kind of permanent visa, or at least 2 or 3 years. So I think this has to change very rapidly. This is the minimum we owe to those who are raising their voice against the war in Russia and from Russia. The comment on the gas and oil embargo, maybe I leave to Michael Harms. We had some arguments about that from the beginning of the war, because we have been advocating an immediate oil and gas embargo, but probably you know that there had been strong counter arguments, especially from the German business community, that is what lead to a kind of breakdown of the German industry. So Michael Harms, a lot of stuff to comment on, but maybe two specific questions in addition. The first one, I think it would be of interest for all of us to hear a little bit more about the speech of the German Chancellor at their annual conference. There had been some noise about his remarks about future cooperation with Russia. Maybe you could put it into the context the statement was made. And the second one, to come back to a formula of Jens, I wonder if you agree with all the three conditions he named for return of any kind of cooperation with Russian authorities. First, the war has to end, and it has to end second in a way that Ukraine will remain free, independent, and with territorial integrity. And third, interestingly, he said Putin has to go. Would you share this?
Very interesting questions, Mr. Fuchs. Thank you very much. First of all, that was not our annual conference. It was our anniversary. The 70th anniversary of the so-called Ostausschuss, founded back in 1952. It was an initiative at that time by Ludwig Erhard and Konrad Adenauer. And it is an interesting development, which has a lot of also connection to the current situation, because at that time, due to the Hallstein Doctrine, West Germany at that time didn't have any diplomatic ties with the countries which recognized the German Democratic Republic as an independent state. So no political ties with the whole Eastern Bloc. And then this business structure was founded, but Adenauer and Erhard asked the industry to pave the way at least for an re-establishing of business connections with the East, which was very successful for the German Empire in the 20s, for example, before the war, before Nazi regime. And it was a success story. The German entrepreneurs were the front runners of re-establishing first business ties, but then also diplomatic relationship after the visit of Adenauer to Moscow and so on and so forth. But at that time, we even concluded at the Ostausschuss trade agreements with Romania, with China, with the Soviet Union, and so on. Why do I mention the Chancellor's speech? I'm sorry, you asked about that. The Chancellor said, after harshly criticizing Russia for the war in Ukraine and making clear that Ukraine will be supported as long as it necessary, he said that even after the war, Russia would be the biggest country on the European continent, and one day we will have to re-establish our connections, not only business connections, but the kind of cooperation with Russia. After having said that, it was a strong applause in the audience. And then Scholz said, "But this day is not now." Yeah, and I repeat, this day is not now. And then he mentioned the conditions. So it was a little bit, I think, misperceived in the media. He in no way argued for somehow weakening the sanctions or having some ties with Russia in current times. I found it much, and Robert Habeck, who was also at our conference, said that the history of the Ostausschuss is, he described it in 3 steps. Complicated, much complicated, most complicated, and most complicated is now. And I also agree with him, because and I mentioned that in the time of the Cold War, we had at least somehow stable and transparent structures, and business could be an important part for keeping channels of cooperation open and paving the way also for political coexistence. Yeah? And here I fully agree with Jens Siegert and with everybody who mentioned that before in the discussion, that currently I do not see, and German business does not see, I can really say it quite bluntly here, any chance of having cooperation and not partnership, but any kind of official cooperation with Russia or with Russian state institutions. We had a discussion in our board, a very cautious discussion. I can also say it quite frankly here. If we can somehow discuss with civil society in Russia or with non-governmental organizations some cooperation in 3 areas: healthcare, climate, and food security, and even that was completely rejected by our board by the entrepreneurs itself. So I fully agree here with Mr. Siegert that I do not see also in the climate issue, which is very important and where we had a very promising cooperation before the war. I do not see nowadays any chance for some joint projects or even for a dialogue. Only, and here I agree with Nora, maybe from the political side in an international framework, in a UN framework. This is maybe the only way which I see. Talking about an embargo, I'm sorry, but this is wishful thinking. If we had established an embargo in spring, we would have 2 results. So no political, no public support for Ukraine any longer, because we would have strong deficits in energy supply and heating and so on in Germany. So it would we wouldn't have the political support, and we wouldn't have the money to give it to Ukraine, because it would immediately destroy big parts of German industry. So therefore, I cannot agree that that would be a good way. And the third question, sorry, I'm talking I'm talking for too long. I'm often asked what is the condition, the precondition for a dialogue or for business with Russia. I'm always saying that for me or for us, it's a fair and sustainable peace agreement in Ukraine. Yeah, but I do not say it publicly, because it may be perceived as a kind that the Ostausschuss is arguing for a regime change. But I also fully agree. A real new start would be possible only after Putin, only after the person Vladimir Putin. Maybe not a regime change that the whole system of Putin would change, but this person has no trust at all, also among business community. So therefore, I also agree that I can imagine that only after Putin is not in power any longer.
Thanks a lot. That's I would say 1 year ago, this would be have been a very surprisingly coincidence or agreement. So to come back to your initial remarks, no parallel to the early 50s, other business working as a kind of pioneer to re-establish political, diplomatic relations with Russia. It was more a confirmation what you have been saying than a question. So, are there any statements or remarks from our audience, please? Where's the mic? We have some hands already.
That's the mic.
Jana
that was-
Sabanova, you
yeah.
you know from the previous panel. Yeah.
So I have two questions, and first for Michael Harms. I'm curious, so we don't know when Putin will go, he'll dies or whatever happens. So do you see the German business community kind of trying to maybe expand its presence in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan? And we know that a lot of Russian companies also, or foreign companies, relocated there. So that would be, do you see like strategic presence there as an important priority? And for Nora, or in general for the panelists, I'm wondering about the German like political sentiment. We don't know when Putin will go and what happens, but is there like some strategic thinking about the options, scenario building? Or there is thinking what would be plan A, plan B for the next in 10 years? Because I don't see that, but probably it's not like open in the media. So I would be curious if you have any insights, or you can share them if you have them. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I think we should collect maybe one or two more questions. Yeah. Yeah. Please.
Thank you. I'm Olivia from the previous panel. I suppose my question actually builds on yours. I'm curious to know whether in the German government, but also within industrial sort of ecosystems, there are different scenarios, not just in terms of 10 years from now, what would our relationship with Russia look like, if I understood your question correctly, but right now, what are the sort of opportunities, risks, the costs of engaging with Russia, on what sector, isolating Russia, what kind of strategy that would look like in terms of working with partners in Asia, in Africa, and things like this, and sort of really trying to understand essentially what type of relationship can we envisage in the future with Russia, but based specifically on how fast can we sort of, bring Russia to stop this war, building upon the systems rivalry sort of, aspect, and sort of engaging with a number of different actors, and how much there is conversation between the German government and the industrial actors, therefore, on this type of strategy. And maybe I would also just sort of remark on the part of you mentioned wishful thinking. I think that I would invite us all collectively to maybe refrain from, we're talking about a paradigm shift. The war in Ukraine represents a fundamental paradigm shift where a lot of people who have been raising red alerts on Russia for a long time have been proven right. And I think that there is a lot of collective intelligence essentially to engage with in terms of looking at the problem from different perspectives and really sort of trying to understand where these different voices lead us when we try to reconcile essentially different interests from the German industry, but also trying to sort of also engage with some people in Russia who have been trying to fight against the current sort of establishment in the Kremlin.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would Lucas, wait a moment. I would suggest that because this had been very complex and heavy questions already, I will come back to you after the first round of answers. Who wants to start? I think Michael Harms, you have been addressed most.
Yeah, I can confirm there's a strong interest of German business for example, Central Asia, really a strategic interest. And I think this strategic interest is important mainly in three areas: raw materials and rare earth and anything else which is now any longer we cannot bring it from Russia, but to a strategic raw materials partnership. And I had the honor to accompany Annalena Baerbock on her latest trip to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It was one of the main issues. So she had a business delegation, first time in her term as Minister of Foreign Affairs. The second is logistics and global gateway, the so-called middle corridor, so connection to China. And the third is being present in the region, but avoiding the reputational and other risks being present further in China. So relocation from Russia to, for example, Kazakhstan and other. These are the three main drivers, and the effects are also amazing. We have much more projects there. We have a growth by almost 100% in bilateral trade with these countries. So it's rather interesting. And the second question may be about we definitely need scenarios for our future relationship with Russia. Frankly speaking, we have not started the discussion yet, but just absence of time. So we were so occupied with all the Ukraine questions and sanctions and so on and so forth. Therefore, we also do not have a dialogue with the federal government on that issue. What we badly would say need that. It's really very, very important.
Yeah, maybe I can add before I will ask the other panelists to respond that we are also working on these scenarios with our international expert network on Russia. But of course, everything depends from the end game, the outcome of the war. And so maybe we should focus on that and the lack of unity in the West. What is our strategic goal for the end of this war is a point of vulnerability. And I think this is the imminent question that the US and the major European players have to find a common position. What is our goal regarding the end game of the war? And this is not just about formulas. Yeah, formulas are super official. And if you have a certain strategic goal about the ending of the war, then of course you have to then develop the scenarios for the future relations with Russia. If you really want, determined that Russia has to win this war militarily, then you have different scenarios what could follow in Russia, from a regime change scenario to a hardening of the nationalistic and authoritarian mindset. So, yeah. So maybe Nora.
Maybe in addition to the question, is there any plan B, C at the table which is being discussed for the time after Putin and the aggression in the Ukraine? There is not, because that would be all assuming. The only point I will make is what for sure can be expected whenever this will be, like a new government in place in Russia, that will come out of civil society. So I think the only answer we would give at the moment is we are more than keen, however we can do, to support civil society in Russia to empower themselves and enable by creating new parties, organizing elections at some point again, creating new governments, and then observe what will be created, what kind of state, how much will it be a democracy. But really this sharing a plan C on a base of what we are facing right now would there would be no realistic answer I could give right now. And to your point of, let's say, a counter offer, when watching Russia really getting aggressively into certain African countries, especially the raw material analysis you gave us earlier on, Olivia. I think, again, only I can add to the points I made earlier with, again, the EU coming in with an alternative offering different partnerships, energy and climate partnerships with a long-term perspective, coming with a trust building approach, is that I cannot say with which countries this will work out mid and long term. The only thing I can say is partnerships at the end of the day only work two ways, right? So it will be actually more on the future or nowadays partners of ours who will decide on that, right?
Any other comments from the panel? Jens Siegert.
Ich würde da gerne gleich darauf reagieren, auf diese Fragen, was kann man machen?
I would like to answer the questions, what can be done? And I'm always happy when I hear, fortunately, this is now a general understanding in Germany that Russia, the civil society has to be supported in Russia. But I would suggest and advise you that the political opposition and civil society, or even though sometimes they are intertwined also by the same people, but you should still not be confused about them. As regards to civil society, as a matter of fact, most of the people who have committed in some way are being suppressed in Russia. People who left Russia are mostly those people who simply personally were at risk. So they were forced to leave the country. It's not that they really wanted to leave the country. And the same goes for the political part. But the political part, this is something we have a problem with, because actually exiled politicians are actually dead politicians in principle. So we can, of course, discuss a lot of scenarios, but I can't imagine any scenario where Russia, like Germany after the Second World War, was occupied and was actually administered from outside. So actually, in some way or other, those will be forces from inside Russia, no forces of the present regime, maybe opposition forces, which we don't know yet. There will be somehow some Russian forces which will take power, and they will play a role in this post-Putin Russia, people who are now living in Russia, not people who are living outside Russia. And that is why I think that when we think of political parties, and political parties are only developing in exile, there is no other way. And therefore, you have to be very careful. It's a lot of effort, and it's certainly leading us nowhere. If there are any opposition people in Russia at all who really deserve the name politicians, then those are the people who are now in prison. Navalny, Yashin, so people who, for Navalny, it's true that also because of his political career, they had to be sacrificed. But people who otherwise are credible in Russia, those are people I can't see. And I say so against the background what happened 30 years ago, and also during the first 10 years in the 90s. All that is still incredibly present.
Now, a final question from the audience. Two, I see two hands, but let's start in the last row. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Matthias Hamens, my name. My short question is, as I understood, there are still German companies operating in Russia, especially also companies that build military material. And my question is regarding the German government. Are those companies forced to switch off their machines in Russia because they work online? So as, for instance, other companies can switch off my online computer, etc. Are those German companies forced to switch off their machines in Russia, or are they still producing? And the second question regarding the future of Russia, I'm a little bit confused regarding Navalny, because I understood Russia acts as an empire, and if we see the people on the front line, it's very often like the people from the Far East who are part of the empire and who are very much suppressed. So who actually in the alternative Russian political scene is willing to break up the imperial structure of Russia, because, as I understood, this would be a more peaceful future. Thank you.
Yeah, the question of all questions. Yeah.
My name is Walter Kasper of German Watch. Good to be here and to see old faces again. Hello, Jens. I have a question looking towards the long-term future of Russia, because I think this is a moment where we have to discuss that question as well, not only looking towards how to end the war and to what to do that what can be done that Russia over the next couple of years could develop in another sense, in another way. But what are the path dependencies that we can help with changing towards a long-term, more democratic, European, globalized, whatever, Russia? And I think one thing that actually Ashok has mentioned is oil and gas deliveries, where we have Germany has a bad footprint, let's say, where Ashok is true. The current Russian state and the current Russian government are to quite a big extent the product of the resource curse. And Germany is probably the country that has imported most.
We have feeded that.
Yeah, we have probably imported most, accumulated over the history, most of oil and gas, coal maybe as well, from Russia than any other country globally. So this is the flip side of the partnership with Russia, which adds to the responsibility for also dealing with Russia in the future, in my opinion at least. And my question is, and that is a question to probably all people in the panel, what do you think, can we at least, when the war is over, keep a regime without importing Russian oil, without importing Russian gas and coal as well, of course, but I think that is less of a question currently. But to when we restart economic relations with Russia, that we would not build on these raw materials, but develop something completely else. Maybe this is a bit too visionary and senseless in a way, but I think making that discussion, starting that discussion now, I mean, this is an impetus. If not this war, if not this shock, is an impetus for starting this discussion now. Where is that moment to start that discussion? And probably you know this. This is my last sentence on this. Probably you know about this school of thought within political science and economic science that says that if a country is dependent to quite a big extent on exporting oil or gas or other raw materials, but the main problem is oil in this theory, then it has no chance at all to developing democratic institutions. No chance. There is no country in the world historically that has done that. All countries that are democracies that are successful and exporting oil have had these democratic institutions already when they found the oil. That is Norway and a couple of else. And we are seeing the slipping, the bad way democracy is developing in the US and other oil exporting countries as well now. I'm slipping here, but I think this is the main question where Germany has a responsibility. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Now, final round on our panel. I would like to start maybe with Ashok. Ashok, would you make some final remarks, please?
About Russian imperialism and Navalny and other Russian oppositional people, yeah. In Russia, we are talking a lot about Russian imperialism and colonialism, and it's very important, yeah, but after we will have a revolution or changes in Russia, and we will start building democratical institutions, then yeah, our struggle will continue. Climate activists will continue to fight for climate justice in Russia, and like other kind of activists will continue to fight for their causes. And yeah, it's an eternal struggle. Yeah, it's normal thing. And so yeah, and when Navalny will be in power, then we just will continue to do activism in democratic Russia, and Russia won't be more threat than like the US or other countries. It will be like just back to normal, and we will have a lot of other problems like permafrost is melting, and like I don't know, most of the infrastructure in Russia is under threat, and we will have a lot of problems to struggle. Like we will have to rebuild our economy, we will have to pay reparations to Ukraine, and we will have a lot of things to do. So Russia won't be interested in imperialism things. Russia will be interested in cooperation, and Navalny and other Russian opposition politicians, they do understand it, of course.
Thanks a lot. Maybe Jens?
Ja, im Grunde habe ich,
Well, basically, I believe I have already answered the key questions. I think what we always have to pay attention to, our influence on what happens in Russia is minimal. Hopefully, we will be able to influence the war Russia launched against Ukraine, but what will happen in Russia afterwards, this will be decided in Russia. And I believe this is the most important prerequisite to thinking about what will happen in the future afterwards. Of course, it is necessary that the Russian mindset, and this is not just the leadership can afford that because it's very much enshrined in the society, and not an imperialist, but an imperial self-image of this country. This is very big. The problem is that the country as such doesn't have a very big self-image in general. And in particular, it hasn't got an idea of where it starts and where it ends, which is one of the reasons for this war against Ukraine. And this is a long process. Russia, up until recently, was an imperial country. Perhaps the Russia we have today is still imperial, and perhaps it will not continue to exist within the borders that were in place under international law before March 2014, borders which are still applicable today. But all these will be very painful processes, like all other dissolutions of imperia, perhaps even more painful, because the Russian imperium is not an overseas, but directly in front of the own borders, and you don't know exactly. So it's probably more comparable to Germany than the UK or France. And to start searching now or setting conditions, we can only cooperate with those who underwrite all that. I would not think that would be politically wise. It's of course no longer possible with Putin, this is clear, but with nearly all others, except the direct entourage of Putin. We have to see what opportunities there are for political cooperation, whether there is or the chance to build at least minimum trust.
Maybe answering the concrete questions about the machinery in the Russian military complex. Yes, there are German machines still running there, but these machines were exported to Russia before 2014. Yeah, because since 2014 we have very strict dual-use sanctions for equipment going to Russia, and it was the time before Industry 0.0, and there's no service for these machines since that time. So I'm very skeptical if they can be switched off online, just because it's almost 10 years where there was no service at all and no contractors to these machines. The question of how is a restart with Russia possible without being dependent on oil and gas and other things? I think it's a question more for us. The faster we organize our own energy transformation, the better would be our chance to not being dependent on Russia. But currently, frankly speaking, I'm very skeptical if we can really hit Russia having these price cap and having the import ban on oil, because Russia is just too important for the global oil market, and the oil is just substituted. So the China and India, they previously bought their oil in Saudi Arabia, or I don't know, in Venezuela, and now they are buying Russian oil. And the traders which traded Russian oil from Switzerland, they are now moved to VAE and Dubai and other places, and they are doing that quite successfully. So we can diminish and reduce Russia's income from exporting, but currently we should be realistic. It's just again too important and cannot be completely substituted by other sources globally.
Thanks a lot. And finally, Nora.
Yeah, to add on the first question, which to me sounded like, could the German government commit a cyber attack towards industry being based in Russia? I will say no. The only way German government can hinder industry operating in Russia right now, and that goes for anywhere, is through trade agreements or rules, or no trade at all, or sanctions, which we are doing in an EU compound. And I think to the second question, we heard a lot of thoughts. I think I will just add again, I think we have discussed around that for a bit in the first part. I think short term, this is still, right, we are in between this fossil fuel driven industry. For some countries, it's about 45, which are crucial fossil fuel driven industries, which are heavily exporting their fossil fuels to the world, has been a profitable business. We are now at a shift. Nobody can exactly say when this will turn around, and this can not and will not be a business any longer. But I think it's already interesting to see between those very different fossil fuel exporting countries that they take very different strategies and approaches, where I would say right now Russia, and this will be interesting to see under a potentially new government at some point, which strategy they will take under a new government. But for now, they have taken a very old-fashioned and only based on fossil fuel exporting approach, while including the Arab countries, they are already taking like different bits and pieces, still selling their fossil fuels as long as they can. Our friends and partners in the US, very similar, right? We won't see them phasing out of oil and gas in the near future. But at the same time, we do see some serious movements that they are keen to do a green transition as well, and see industry strategy behind that. But again, we are in the middle of that shift, and it's hard to tell, are we gonna see this turnaround in the next 10 years? Or might it be still more 20 years, right? And that will really be essential for some countries, because again, their whole revenues and income is based on that, right? And how much have they already been successful in shifting their industries? And that will actually define, and this is I think, as important and interesting question, how much will we see democratic states evolving? Because again, they have done steps and created future industries and workplaces in their countries, believing in that, let's say, the green narrative. Or will we see some of the countries which we by now call democratic, which are still very fossil fuel driven, falling apart because they haven't, right? So again, I think that democratic question in that whole looking at the industry and strategy is a very important one.
Thanks a lot. Just two final comes closing remarks from my side. I fully agree with Kaspar Oldak that there is an inherent correlation between this kind of fossil fuel rent economy and authoritarianism. Of course, it's not a linear one, but there is a tendency that this kind of economy and authoritarian the government are reinforcing each other. And this was one of the motivations of our project when we started it. Yeah, how could we encourage and support Russia in departing from that model and transforming into a kind of modern innovation-based and market economy. So then, as I deliberated in my initial remarks, of course, the whole political development went counter that idea, and I think we only can reconnect after fundamental political change in Russia. And someone made a the growing internal repression in Russia and the war against Ukraine, because they destroyed this idea of kind of modernization partnership. And someone today in the discussion made the remark that we have to prepare or to be prepared for change in Russia. So maybe this kind of work and the scenarios of ecological modernization in Russia have not been in vain. And the second remark is on the question, if and how can we influence domestic developments in Russia? Yeah, Jens said we should be clear that we have very little leverage and only a very little influence. I'm not so sure about that currently, because I think our main possibility to support and maybe even to trigger change in Russia is now supporting Ukraine. Only with a military defeat then in Ukraine there will be any chance for change to the better in Russia, also regarding the departure from this kind of imperial mindset. And making Ukraine a success story, this, I think, is the biggest leverage we have for future developments in Russia. I leave it with that. Thank you very much. And we would like to invite you to a small get-together and reception, and hope we can continue our cooperation for a better future. Thank you very much.